My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. I was going back and forth on changing the name of this conversation, just going through some of your posts, Charles. I think we'll have an interesting conversation, but introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get involved, interested in markets and the economy? And what are you doing currently?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michael. And I just heard you give a master class in investing in your interview with Adam Taggart at Wealthion. And I want to recommend everybody listen to that. And if anything's unfamiliar in your conversation with Adam, then it'll take a few hours of very worthy research to understand everything you guys discussed. But it was a terrific interview. But where I entered the picture was I was writing about housing and related issues as a freelance writer in the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 80s and 90s. And then we saw the housing bubble start rising in the early 2000s. And so I started looking at the financial aspects of that and started writing about that and started my blog. And then that I somehow, by some unknown process, developed an audience. I think it was partly because housing was hot and there was a debate, would housing ever go down? This was not a bubble. And of course, that introduced me to system dynamics, how it's just so interesting that things like bubbles are always dismissed as, no, this is not a bubble. This is, it's different this time and so on. And then the bubbles always pop with devastating results. And so that kind of led me further down the whole economics, rabbit hole. And that's where I am now, 18 years later, exploring the rabbit holes.
Okay. So I've said in the past many times that the last great bubble, since you mentioned bubbles, last great bubble is faith in the Fed, which doesn't seem like it's a bubble, but I'd argue it is. And maybe that's being questioned given the way that treasuries are selling off and yields are rising despite inflation expectations dropping. Is it too cliche to blame bubbles on the Federal Reserve, or is there something just sort of innate in human nature that makes prices get out of whack?
Well, that's a terrific question, Michael, because obviously it calls us up to look at history and we can say, well, there was the South Seas bubble and the tulip bubble in situations where there was no central bank per se. And so certainly there's a speculative potential in the human nature, right? And I kind of call it the desire is built into us for windfalls. And I think it goes back to being hunter-gatherers. And so if you come across a tree that's loaded with fruit, well, your first instinct is not to just pick what you need that moment, but it's to strip the tree and, share with your friends and, exploit the windfall that comes your way. And so when we think there's a windfall possible, then we get very excited and then we start investing in that process, and that generates a bubble, which then becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop because we see other people see us making money, then they want to join the crowd and so on. And so there's a bubble mentality. The Federal Reserve's role is interesting. And I guess I would contextualize it like this. It seems to me that we have an almost mythological or quasi-religious faith in these large institutions like the Fed and even the federal government to kind of like always save the day. In other words, the Titanic can't possibly sink this time because the Fed is omnipotent or omniscient. And then if the Fed somehow dropped the ball, well, then the federal government will step in and, issue however many trillions of dollars it needs to like right the ship, right? And the idea that this is like, we can count on this, as you say, this faith in these large institutions. What nobody seems to be focusing on, that I tend to focus on, is the policy extremes that are required to keep the ship afloat keep getting more and more extreme. And then those start destabilizing the entire economy and society. And yet we look at these institutions as, oh, well, they fixed it. But we don't look at what the unintended consequences, the diminishing returns, and the costs that are being loaded onto the system, right? That make it more and more unstable.
Okay, so that's actually a good direction to go because I like the way that you frame that. They have to keep on fixing prior extremes with even more extreme actions. They have to go further out on their mandates, as we saw post-COVID, to the point where they basically said, we're going to buy up junk debt ETF, right, to stabilize the bond market. And every round of more extreme action from the Federal Reserve, I'd argue, widens the wealth gap, right? So I want to tie that into a theme that you mentioned you want to hit on, which is these social effects of a widening wealth and income inequality dynamic in the country. I have continuously made the argument that every round of stimulus does one thing and one thing only: it widens the wealth gap, right? And you're seeing it now post COVID. They threw trillions of dollars into this. The rich got richer. Everybody else got stuck with inflation. And you even see it, I'd argue, internally in the stock market, where all of the monetary action has resulted in concentration of wealth, even among just a select number of large cap names, which is what make people think we're in a new bull market, while most other things are just flatlining. Let's talk about kind of the history of wealth inequality and how you see the Federal Reserve's role in that.
Okay, and that's a great question. Thank you, Michael. And I just listened to you discuss many things that to me are system dynamics, like the potential for dislocation as pressures rise or as the potential for a quote accident rise. And you were discussing with Adam risk management, and that kind of ties in with this whole discussion is, are risks dropping because the Fed is taking more and more extreme policies? Or is risk rising, but no one's really observing it? And so the Federal Reserve's role initially, as I understand it, and I'm not claiming to be an academic expert, okay? I'm just an observer. But it seems that it was created, its role initially was to limit the damage of credit crises that would then cause credit to tighten to the point that enterprises that would have otherwise survived get destroyed because they can't borrow any more money. And so the idea is, okay, we'll come in as lender of last resort, and in like the panic of 106 or 1877 or whatever, the various panics that led up to this thinking, it was the credit crisis was typically a short-term thing, a few months, and then if it was left unchecked, then it created a mini, like a recession or a depression that lasted for years, right? And so the idea here is we're going to moderate these cycles of credit expansion and contraction and risk suddenly being apparent, and then lending dries up and all that. We're going to modify that by coming in as the lender of last resort. And that makes sense. But as you alluded to a few minutes ago, now the mandate includes creating a wealth effect, so that helps moderate the economic cycle, not just the credit cycle. Now we're going to have a wealth effect so people feel that there's more gain and lower risk in just expanding their borrowing, that they're richer so they can borrow more and spend more, and it's going to be great. So there's this wealth effect that's now a mandate. And then there's also, which I think to your point, your question, what a wealth effect does is theoretically it's going to raise all boats, because the tide's coming in. But what actually happens is people who are able to buy assets at much lower prices and lower rates of interest, they're the ones who capture most of the gains in these like housing bubbles or stock bubbles or bond bubbles. And so it's actually not, as it turns out, that the gains from that kind of thinking that we're going to, keep the economy sort of always bubbling along at a nice expansion, it's asymmetric in how those gains are distributed. And that's kind of, to me, the core of why the already wealthy are getting wealthier is they were able to buy assets at much lower prices and under more favorable conditions. And it's, well, if you get to buy at the start of the bubble, then you're obviously going to get much richer than if you're forced to buy halfway up or near the top.
Right, which is very perverted in a lot of ways, right? I mean, I know one of your themes, because you did an interview with Adam too, on the sort of the era of scarcity. I mean, there's an abundance of everything, but there is scarcity in the sense that it's not available because the high quality parts of the economy are being hoarded by the very wealthy, which have the benefit of being close to those lower rates.
Correct. And just to mention housing, because you and Adam discussed that, and it's a big topic now because, housing, I think the cost of buying a home, the average price of a home has shot up, 25, 30% in a few years or something. And now affordability has plummeted to like less than 20% in many parts of the country and so on. So these are extremes. And then what are the social consequences? And one of the things I find interesting, and I know you do too, is we manage what we quantify, what we measure. And so we can measure, median house prices and mortgage rates and that kind of stuff. What we don't measure, because it's difficult to measure, is what are the social costs and consequences of this kind of unaffordability of housing, or forcing young families to stretch themselves to like extreme limits that 2 generations ago, no one had to spend 2/3 of their net income on housing. That would have been unacceptable or appalling. And now it's like, oh, well, yeah, everybody spends half or more of their net on housing, whether it's like super high rent or it's a mortgage. And so what's the social consequence of that? And I think there's a generational inequality and divide that we see, but nobody really discusses that it's going to have a potential impact at some point. And so the social consequences are piling up, but we don't really measure them. So we don't see them.
No, okay, that's actually really interesting. And I guess you can measure some small portion of it, right? So, I mean, to the extent that the cost on society can be seen through rising obesity, healthcare, stress impacting average lifespans, because, what's the major reason for people's stress? It tends to be money and being able to afford things. I mean, presumably you can measure some of it, but to your point, there's so much more to it that can't be quantified. And because it can't be quantified, you can't necessarily create a clear policy response to it.
Right. And like you said in your interview with your discussion with Adam, what we all want is, theoretically, we want to be able to manage the outcome that we want. And so what's interesting about these interconnected systems that we're talking about, like finance, the economy, technology, and official policy, moves to correct what's seen as a problem, all those things interact in a complex fashion, right? And so it's like, the outcome isn't always as predictable as we would hope or as policymakers may think, right? There's this 2 dynamics that occur quite regularly are diminishing returns. Like you push something and the initial result is real powerful, like you drop interest rates near zero. Wow, that's terrific. Suddenly you've created new demand because people can afford to borrow more and buy more with that because their interest service is so much lower. And so you get that. But then if you keep doing more of that, then the results diminish, right? And that's just kind of like how systems work. The other one is unintended consequences, right? And so then so now it seems to me that we've reached this idea that, well, we just print more money or create more credit, however you want to term it, to get over any rough patch. But then there's a consequence of that, which is the cost of servicing all that debt eventually rises, even in near zero interest rate Japan, right? I mean, even if your interest rate's 0.1%, if you pile up enough, it starts becoming consequential. It starts squeezing out other spending, right? So there's that kind of unintentional consequence that kind of builds up under the surface, And so what I find interesting is the outcomes are not being generated that we thought. Like everyone seemed to think the Federal Reserve could create 4 trillion in stimulus and the federal government could add another 6 or 8 trillion and it would all be fine. It's like, oh, wait a minute, it created inflation. And so I think another topic of interest is there's generational, like long-term kind of changes in the global economy that sort of like made it easy to lower interest rates, right? And I know you've talked about this a lot, in other words, the emergence of China as the manufacturing hub of the world, and that was a deflationary impulse around the world, right? And then the growth of money supply globally was positive. And so we had this sort of like positive context of the whole global economy. And now I think there's a lot of that is reversing. And so suddenly we have headwinds where we used to have tailwinds. And so the policies that worked when everything was actually pretty golden, now they're not working. And so then the policy makers, their first instinct is, well, let's do more of what worked back then, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But now that is actually creating more problems than it's solving.
That deflationary impact on China and, from China rather, I mean, that's, you can argue largely it's the labor arbitrage argument, right? Which is, as the world got more and more flat and globalization got more entrenched, you could hire somebody in India and China at a fraction of the cost of the US. And, that's where the margins go up. I thought AI was supposed to be sort of the next evolution of that from the standpoint of that's a disinflationary or deflationary force. And I mentioned it, going back to the interview with Adam Taggart, it doesn't make much sense to me. And I want to get your thoughts on this because I know you've looked at the AI side quite a bit too. It doesn't make sense to me that you have the supposed revolutionary new dynamic with artificial intelligence that's supposed to be disinflationary, yet long duration yields keep rising. And if AI is supposed to be a longer term dynamic, you think that the bond market would sniff that out and say, okay, this is going to cause so much more productivity. This is going to be disinflationary longer term. So yield should be lower on the long end. That's not happening. Is there some validity to the idea that AI is the next level of the labor arbitrage from a globalization scale, or is that just not a narrative that makes sense?
Well, that's a super fascinating topic. And I'm going to hopefully not be too confusing, but I want to kind of touch on several points to respond to that idea. One is that AI is actually an expense, right? I mean, we kind of assume that, well, somebody's going to get laid off so that the enterprise is going to save money because their labor costs are going to go down. But at least initially, you're buying a ton of more technology and servers, and the cost, which is, say, for instance, in search, to take like an example that everyone can understand. Okay, let's get LLMs working on search to improve search. Well, your cost of search goes up a lot. Just the electricity to run all that extra computing power is actually a major expense. And so there's a lot of expenses that may not be, factored in by the market. The other aspect is that what can be easily automated or by AI is what's already digitized. And so what's still much more difficult is real world applications, such as like self-driving trucks and stuff like that, that we sort of presumed were amenable to AI. Like, oh yeah, we can digitize everything. Well, it turns out that as a kind of rule of thumb, digitizing the real world is actually still really difficult. And I've talked about this in some of my writing so like, in other words, you want to create a robot that's going to clean a hotel room like cheaper than a human. Well, it's like, you think about all the different tasks that have to be done by the maid. And it's all like, well, she has to have dexterity, or he or she, empty the trash in a certain way and then wipe this, but then lift a heavy mattress. And, there's quite a bit there. And you kind of go, well, wait a minute, how much is this robot going to cost and to recharge it and keep it programmed? And then compared to a human, maybe the human is actually cheaper still, because the real world is just not as amenable. But what is amenable is what's already digitized. So like anecdotally, as an example, I just heard from somebody that like a major global PR firm is planning to lay off 80% of its staff because it can automate so much of PR campaigns and composition of PR. So it's going to be, the revolution could be kind of backwards of what happened throughout the post-industrial and industrial age, where it was the lower skill physical labor kind of assembly worker in a factory and so on who was displaced by AI and robotics. And now it looks like that's possibly being reversed, and it's the white collar kind of creative type that's going to get displaced. And of course, this is the fear that's driving the big Hollywood strikes, right? So what actually turns out is the craft worker, the welder and this kind of person that has physical skills, or even the so-called low skill, like a maid in a hotel, they're harder to replace than with AI. AI doesn't really do much dent that labor. So those labor costs are actually going up. I mean, anecdotally, I was told that Starbucks workers in California are making $25 an hour. Now, I don't know, and I mean, not senior, this is not management or something. This is just, people in the coffee shop, right? So we're seeing labor costs rising because it seems like we're having labor shortages for the physical world. And then the surplus of labor seems to be in the creative, already digitized fields. So maybe the market's sniffing out that the real world is not going to be as impacted as quickly or deeply as some of these fields that are already digitized. One other factor that I think is often overlooked is, economics comes down to, supply and demand and scarcity and abundance, right? And so if these AI tools are all free. Now people are trying to monetize them, but I think the genie's out of the bottle. There's going to be a lot of free tools. And so how can a company generate a monopoly, which is what the ideal for sustaining profits, right? Or a quasi-monopoly or a cartel? How can you lock in your customer base and because you have something that no one else has? And I don't think that's going to be the case in AI. Everyone's going to have an AI version. And that superabundance means it's going to have zero value.
No, actually, that point about the PR side is interesting. So sure, it results in layoffs for the creatives that are not so much in the physical labor side of things, but then at some point they have to get an income after getting laid off from AI. So then they start working at Starbucks, right? And then suddenly that tight labor dynamic gets resolved just because not of new entrants, but because of a shift of the existing players.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's where the economies around the world that are most flexible, I think, will benefit as a sort of general rule. In other words, the more open you are to these kinds of changes that are fast happening and they're triggered and they sort of they feed on themselves. If you can create some way to allow for those changes, then you're probably going to do better because you're going to adapt and evolve faster than economies that are trying to lock down stuff and manage it in a certain way, that usually benefits, some elite. So that's another thing I look for is who's open to fast adaptation and adoption of new technologies and who's willing to take the risk of evolution. The faster you're allowed to evolve, the more likely you're going to come up with solutions, even if it's a painful process.
Just to reset the room here, everybody, please make sure you follow Charles here on X. If you want to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button. And as always, this will be a podcast under Lead Lag Live. Do you get a sense that AI is going to make the wealth gap even wider, or will it maybe help level the playing field a bit?
Well, that's also a great topic because there's a whole spectrum of what's called AI, right? And so the media tends to focus on like what can replace the human worker entirely. But actually, I think the more realistic view, as I understand it, the more realistic view is like there might be a welder in a shop and then the welding machine is like partly, digitized and the controls and the software. And so it might be that there's a lot of improvements. This is my hope, at least, is there's improvements in productivity because real world workers will be able to have smarter tools, but they're still going to be needed. In other words, it's not like the welding machine is going to be automated and replace the human. It's like they're going to kind of form a synthesis of skills. And so, because humans have a lot of advantages over robots and they're actually still pretty cheap. Human labor, it's not that expensive for when you compare like the output that's possible. And so you take like really complex systems like oil refineries and ships. And there's just so many things in the real world that are very complicated. And human talent combined with, some AI level skilled tools or analytics, that's a powerful combination. So I think the media is probably focusing on the sort of wrong thing, which is like, how can AI replace a human entirely? That's probably not where we're going to pick up our productivity gains. So we may not actually lose the kind of, they're talking numbers like 300 million people will lose their jobs. It's like, maybe not.
Right. And I find it hard to believe that we will ever have a period in the future where if somebody's getting a surgery, they're going to be comfortable, with a robot doing it without some kind of human control. Right. I mean, there's also, I think, that sort of a basic kind of inbuilt trust of dealing with humans as opposed to some kind of algorithm.
Right. And I've had MDs tell me that, that in their experience, I mean, these are senior doctors that, that in a lot of cases is in as much as 80% of the correct diagnosis is in actually getting to see the patient, talk to the patient, and so on, as opposed to like some telemed thing where you're looking at some test results that were more or less automated. So there is definitely a role for that. But it's an interesting question, like, will AI be the savior of the global economy, or will it end up being just kind of an overhyped expense, that doesn't really deliver the results that everyone anticipated? And that may be what the market's sniffing out too.
Which is unfortunate if that's the case, right? Because I think there is a hope, which is probably misguided, that, the way you get out of all of this debt that's been built around the globe is with another transformational industry, right? I mean, there is the argument that, maybe it's not inevitable that the system, in quote, collapses under the weight of its own leverage, because something else will come out that's revolutionary, that can be taxed, that suddenly now resolves all of that built up misalignment of capital. If it's just an expense and it's not as revolutionary as people think, then you're back to, the inevitable dynamic is going to be probably more deflation as opposed to inflation.
Right. Or like an uncomfortable mix, like the real world stuff will continue to be scarce or pot for various reasons, such as depletion or geopolitical stuff. And what will be abundant will lose value. Yeah, that's the thing, is what's going to be scarce and what's going to be abundant. And how many scarcities that we have now are actually artificial. And so there's an argument, say, in housing, and I think it can be backed up with data, that we're actually not having a housing shortage. We're having an ownership crisis because...
Say that louder, please. I thank you for saying that. That's actually the way that I should have framed it myself, because I've made that argument myself. It's a concentration issue. It's not a supply issue.
Right. It's an ownership issue, that the top 10% have bought up a ton of housing, and a lot of it for the Airbnb short-term rental, and I think that's a bubble of the same type that we discussed before. Everybody looks around and goes, hey, that house rented for $2,000 a month, but this guy I know is making $10,000 a month off Airbnb. And so everybody just rushed into that, like literally a land rush, after the lockdown. And so and I'm not sure that anybody knows how many houses are actually Airbnb rentals. I think the data is probably not as hard as everyone would like. As you say, it can be listed as a second home. It can be a investment property, blah, blah, blah. So we don't know, but there's a significant number, because I hear so many anecdotal stories, and from around the world, by the way, including I hear these stories from people, my readers in Australia, Canada, and around the US, where they're saying there's just extreme local housing shortages, and yet on their street, 8 out of 9 houses are empty. It's like, what? Wait, well, then what's causing the housing shortage? And it's an ownership issue, and not like an actual scarcity of physical dwellings.
Right. Which then goes back to it's a wealth gap inequality issue, right? Because you've got to be very wealthy for the concentration. And then there's two branches to that, right? There's wealth inequality in terms of the very wealthy and everybody else, but then the wealth inequality of corporations to individuals. Right?
That's right.
Both are big factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to going back to your theme of how's our faith in the Fed? Is it actually reality based or not? And of course, people that look at this wealth inequality in housing, everyone goes back to, the Fed made it so cheap, to borrow money, and the liquidity was gushing around, that then it was like, that suddenly made buying rental housing extremely attractive. Because, if you can get a 3% mortgage and you're earning 5% return, on your rental, it created like a rocket booster for the housing market to drop interest rates, increase liquidity, and drop mortgage rates to historic lows, right? Literally less than half of the normal historic average, which is around 6 or 7, and suddenly it's like under 3. So you created a rocket booster for people who had the means to buy a second or third home, or 6 or whatever, or corporations to go buy 1,000 or 10,000. Yeah. So that's how we ended up where we are today. And with, as you say, artificial housing shortages, extreme concentrations of wealth, and then we've locked out people that are not already wealthy, and they tend to be younger, and, they didn't inherit wealth, or, didn't get to go to the bank of mom and dad.
Right. That goes back to the start of the conversation around the societal effects of these dynamics are really ugly. I keep referencing that point, with China, right? Not just China. Youth unemployment. When you have a younger generation unemployed and bored, as you'd typically expect, they tend to find themselves getting into trouble. And sometimes, and even oftentimes historically, that trouble tends to result in protests and revolutions and things of that nature. So all these do have real negative impacts on, to your point, the very fabric of society.
Right. And then just to add to your point, debt and the sort of like purchasing power of your labor. These are like key elements in any economic discussion, and so the fact that we went from like near zero student loan debt, say in the late, 90s, and now there's $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. And it's all like, how did we manage to educate tens of millions of people for a fraction of the sums that we now spend on it? And of course, there's lots of arguments in there that to me are sort of distractions. Like, the states used to spend more of their budget on education, so then the universities had to like triple their tuition. But we all know that the fact of the matter is it was like a windfall for the higher education, and that the number of professors, this is a fact, the number of tenured professors has barely moved in 20 years. It's flatlined, but then the number of administrators has gone up like fivefold. And of course, every administrator gets, 200 or 300 grand, right? Because they're assistant dean to the assistant of, provost of diversity or whatever. And so there's this huge proliferation of just squandered waste, really, in the higher education. No one wants to say that because that sounds so bad, and it's not like, yeah, but that's the truth. You give people trillions of dollars to spend however they want, and you're going to get a tremendous amount of waste, and you're going to end up with a tremendous amount of debt. So here we are saddling young people with $1.5 trillion in debt before they even start work. And then we've reduced the purchasing power of their wages for like 40 years. And it's all like, and then they're supposed to be super happy thinking that this is the land of opportunity and all this stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm older and I look at it and I go, wow, this is really unfair because I actually was able to earn enough and to build my own house and stuff in my 20s. And I don't think that a normal, like average income person could pull off what I did. And it wasn't like I got an inheritance or I found some way to make a ton of money. I just earned average wages, but I was frugal, And so it's like, can somebody do what I did? And if the answer is no, then I think something's really wrong with our economy.
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. I've had this discussion with my mother, right? So my parents were immigrants from Egypt to the US. My father was dirt poor when he came here. And, he was passionate, learned the language, learned the culture, found his way to getting an MBA, ended up working at IBM, Merrill Lynch, had then built multiple businesses. But, I often say to my own mother, had that story been repeated now, given just the system, the dynamics, using your term, that we have in place here, I don't know if, my father would be able to have the same level of success. The environment's very different, than it was decades ago.
Yeah, right. And then I think that's a good point. And so the question is it just some kind of global changes that we can't really, that are like, they're dynamics that are outside the reach of policies, or have they been exacerbated by the policies? And I think that's where we come back to, has the Federal Reserve's policies exacerbated this wealth inequality and sort of drained the purchasing power, via steady inflation of wages, and also by sort of favoring capital as opposed to favoring labor, as it kind of, there's always got to be a balance, because the vast majority of peoples are earning their income not from capital, but from their labor. And this is even very successful people like your father. It's still their labor that's creating the value, right? It's not just they're sitting back and living off only the capital. And so you want to have a balance. And I think we've lost that balance. And I think that's part of the social kind of pendulum swing back, I think, to where, hey, wait a minute, we're going to have to favor labor here for a little bit just to kind of reset the equilibrium of the whole economy. And so that means we're going to have to take away some of all the favorable stuff that was given to capital.
I think that's a good transition to your book on self-reliance, which in the initial description sounds to me like a concept not that similar from sort of, how do you become anti-fragile, right? Sort of the Nassim Taleb way of looking at things, how do you grow from uncertainty, right? Talk about just that book that you put together on self-reliance and why you think it's so important to focus on that now.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I think you're absolutely right. It is basically inspired by the idea of anti-fragility and Nassim Taleb, that the ideas, my idea was to write about self-reliance in the 21st century. And like we all know what self-reliance was when Emerson wrote his famous essay entitled Self-Reliance in 1841 or whatever it was. Self-reliance meant self-sufficiency. You built your log cabin and you kind of did the Walden thing, and it's like, well, that there is still a role for that kind of thinking. But I think in the modern setting, self-reliance is more like lowering your exposure to risks that you don't control. That's how I phrase it. And you can also, maybe that's a description of being anti-fragile. Like you want to lower your risk exposure. You don't have to eliminate it. It's like you don't have to forge your own tools, so to speak. But if you're like living in an environment like your income and your locale and everything is totally dependent on stuff that is flown in from thousands of miles away or piped. In other words, you're really dependent on a really long, fragile global supply chain that you're exposed to risks that you may be underestimating, and if the whole town is dependent on one industry, like used to be like the factory town or the plantation town, if something untoward happens to that industry, then everybody's wiped out, because it's like this was not a broad-based sort of anti-fragile economy. It was dependent on these things that if something goes wrong, then a lot of people are hurt, And so that's where I think that I'm kind of trying to take the self-reliance thing, is try to make your income and your setting and your household, less exposed to bad things happening, if you will. And you go, well, what bad things could happen? And it's all like, well, debt could be a bad thing, frankly. There's kind of like a truism, like if you have zero debt, less bad things can happen to you, And so that, to me, reducing your debt or eliminating it is one step of being more self-reliant, and then developing multiple income streams, and frankly, you're like an example of this. I mean, your personal life story is an excellent template. And I know you're working at a very high level, at a very large scale, but even just like normal people can start developing like side hustles or things to reduce their expenditure on stuff like debt and increase their net. And this is where frugality has been kind of forgotten. And I'm sure that your parents were extremely frugal, and yet we've sort of, as a society, I think we've sort of lost the benefits of frugality.
But admittedly, it's hard to be frugal in general. I mean, aside from just, the instant gratification society that we have.
Yeah.
I mean, right. Everything's, with the click of a button, it can go right to your credit card. So now credit card debt's at $1 trillion, I think was the headline. Across, right. So people may want to be frugal, but the temptation is so high to just put it on the card and deal with it later that it's hard. And then the truth is, I think a lot of people don't have a choice, right, in terms of trying to be frugal, because the starting point is already, way behind relative to inflation. I agree, obviously, on the sort of have multiple sources of income and try to be in domains that you can have some degree of control in terms of the link of effort and result, right? So what I do, lead lag report, I put a lot of content. There's a link between that effort and, the result in terms of hopefully some revenue that buys me some time for the cycle to come my way of my strategies.
Right. And that, to me, it's sort of my idea of self-reliance that I try to promote is just what you're doing, which is the more of your assets and income that you control, hopefully absolutely directly, like you own it. You own your labor, you own your enterprise, you own your skill set. Then you can leverage that as opportunities arise much more than if you're like a wage slave, to use a Marxist term, right? In other words, if you're barely getting by, then you have to ask yourself, is there some other way that I can take more control of my work and my skill set and maybe use it more to my own advantage rather than making somebody else money? And so this kind of leads to the idea of like being an entrepreneur or thinking like an enterprise. I think there's tremendous value in that. And I say that as somebody that I've had jobs, I've worked for people, but I've been self-employed most of my life. And I think that it's like, if you think like an entrepreneur, even if you're working for somebody else, it helps you think through like, where's my opportunities? Where my risk exposure? What's the payoff? The risk return kind of thing. And where can I invest my time where I'm going to actually leverage what I know or who I know, And so I think there's a lot of, people can manage what they do own and have, even if it's just their labor, they can do better if they think it out like the way an entrepreneur does.
Yeah, easier said than done, as we know, especially when, again, there's so many distractions. But that I think is always the challenge. I mean, on the one hand, you can argue it's never been easier to start a business and to be entrepreneurial. On the other hand, the dopamine effect of entertainment, which is available with the click of a button, distracts us from actually diversifying properly and, being more self-reliant, which is why we end up ultimately looking back to the government and looking back to the Fed. I mean, it's all connected in that way.
Yeah. And I think that you're absolutely right about raising the point is I think, in my view, and again, I'm older, and so you could say, well, you're out of touch with reality, and say, yeah, maybe so. But I think that people have become a little too complacent and too dependent on like the government to save them. In other words, the government is supposed to like fix everything in our lives, right? And what happens if the government is unable to do so? And I think that in the larger context that we're discussing, I think we're in an inflationary period. And, it's like there's a lot of drivers for inflation, like demographics, resource depletion. There's a lot of things that aren't like amenable to some policy fix. And so then the policy fix that everyone turns to is like, let's just print money or let's just lower interest rates and let's do a financial fix for like what's actually the real economy. And so financial fixes are okay if they're limited, but now they're not limited. Now they're reaching extreme levels. And so now they're feeding inflation. And so the government's ability to bail us all out and to save the day is now becoming inhibited by inflation, right? And geopolitical forces and resource depletion or the cost of extracting resources going up. So all of those factors, I think we have headwinds, and therefore we can't count on the government to like fix everything in our lives. And I know that sounds like, well, what are you saying? And I'm saying that there's a proper role for the government, but if it overextends itself and overreaches, it actually generates unintended consequences and may create problems that either are worse or that end up overloading the system to where the system cracks. And then it was like, whoops, now what do we do? If you can't solve it by printing more money, then what's the solution? And then the solution is, well, we're going to have to get way more efficient and stop squandering money. And we're going to have to start thinking about, like what I call forced frugality. Like, well, how are we going to make the money we have and the resources we have go farther? And of course, we all know that means increasing our productivity like sharply, right? Like getting more results with the same amount of labor capital being invested, right? And so that's the only way to really grow wealth. And so that's the core that we all know. If you're not growing productivity, then you're just creating like artificial, like sort of bubbles of wealth that then pop because they're not being supported by actual increases in production of goods and services.
Yeah, no, very well said. Charles, for those that want to read more of your work, track more of your thoughts, where would you point them to?
Well, certainly start with my Twitter X account, at which I know you'll post. And then my main website is of2minds.com. That's just one word, of2minds.com. And there's all my archives are free and sample chapters of my books are free there. So there's a lot of stuff to, disagree with.
That's a good way to frame it. Everybody, please make sure you follow Charles, check out his website as well. And thank you as always for those that keep on supporting the effort. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.